Thank you very much, Bante. Okay, good evening, brothers and sisters in the Dhamma. Today is the first time I'm actually doing a Dhamma sharing at in this temple. I have actually been here before to run a workshop together with Dr. Pangchingka. I ran some hypnotherapy workshop, but that was not a Dhamma sharing, that was a workshop for mindful relaxation. So today is the first time I'm actually doing Dhamma sharing. And in sharing the Dhamma, I learned from Venerable Dr. Punaji. So a lot of the translations I'm using will be his translations, which may be slightly different from what you read in traditional translations. When I come across that, I will of course point out to you where it differs. Okay. Today's topic is from perception to consequence. Basically, I'm presenting it from a scientific perspective to explain the teachings of the Buddha, how science can actually explain a lot of things that the Buddha has taught. So one of the important things that the Buddha has reminded us is that whenever our sense organs become stimulated by the environment, we begin to be able to see, hear, smell, taste and touch. And when we are able to do that, we begin to experience the environment, and with these sensations we begin to have a feeling, and that feeling can be pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And this feeling actually can arouse emotional reaction. And this emotional reaction is in Pali it is called tanha. But of course the word tanha is translated as craving. But Venerable Dr. Punaji translates tanha as emotional reaction, which is actually very accurate to describe what goes on in the body and in the mind. So that is the main theme of today's sharing. So we're going to explore the Buddha's teaching from a scientific perspective, how perceptions arise when environmental activities stimulate our sense organs, and the mind interprets perceptions, leading to unconscious emotional arousal. And when we experience emotional arousal, the untrained mind reacts to these arousals. And this reaction is emotional. And this reaction is what I mentioned earlier, tanha. Right? And these emotional reactions to the arousal actually lead to stress, dissatisfactoriness and suffering, which is dukkha. And the important thing is that whenever we react, every reaction has a consequence. And that is what we will explore today very briefly through these processes. First, I would like to touch on this point, answering the question, who am I? Most people, when somebody asks you how to explain who am I, many people will just call up your name and say, I am Billy, or I am John, I am Richard, I am so and so. But the name you use is nothing but a label to describe this body and mind. But if we really think about it realistically, when we try to answer this question, who am I? The real answer is basically to say, I am an organism in an environment. And as an organism in an environment, a lot of things are happening in this body of the organism. The first thing that is happening is a process called metabolism. Metabolism is the life-sustaining process. Because of biochemical activity in our cells, all the cells in our body are reacting in a biochemical manner, it keeps us alive. So when there is metabolism in the body, we are alive. When metabolism ceases, the body stops working and then we are dead. So that is how we are kept alive. But in many other religions, the concept of being kept alive does not understand this process of metabolism. In some religions, they say there is a soul in the body that keeps us alive. And when we die, that soul goes to heaven if you have been good, or goes to hell if you have been bad. And that soul is an eternal soul. In many religions, that is what it is. Specifically in Christianity, there is an eternal soul, and that is what keeps us alive. So when we die, this eternal soul either goes to heaven when we have been good, or goes to hell for punishment if we have been bad. That is their concept. But the reality of why we are alive is because of the process of metabolism. And the second thing that is happening in our body is actually consciousness. And this consciousness arises because of our five senses. The five senses is continuously being stimulated by activities in the environment, and that stimulation actually leads us to experience the environment through our consciousness and awareness of our five sensual realms, five physical sensual realms. And that is seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. And this is basically how we experience the environment. And that is all that's really happening. But the rest that is happening is the way we operate our consciousness, the way the mind works when environmental activities stimulate our sense organs. So the environment is a very complex environment today. In fact, we all know it is far more complex than the days of the Buddha. In fact, we even can think back, for those of you who are old enough, you can just think back 20 years ago. The environment was a lot simpler. Why? Simply because 20 years ago we don't have mobile phones. So when we go out, we are very happy to say, okay, we just leave the phone at home because we can't carry the phone with us. Telecoms won't allow us to have a long wire connected to the phone. We don't have mobile phones. So life was very peaceful. When we go to a restaurant and have our dinner, we don't have to worry about the phone ringing. But today, if you leave house and leave your mobile phone behind, you get very worried. Oh, I left my mobile phone behind. And some people even have to run back home to pick up the mobile phone. All that is very stressful. So today's environment is getting more and more stressful because we are using more and more technology. We are depending more and more on technology. The more we depend on technology, honestly speaking, the more stressful things become. Right? And so those of you who have a Facebook account, if you go to your Facebook and then you suddenly see some people in Facebook saying some nasty things to you, how do you feel? Of course you feel unhappy. So these are all technologies, and the more we use and depend on technology, the more we become stressed by the environment, and then we begin to react. So let's explore how environmental activities stimulate sense organ and we begin to react. All this happens because in the body there is a central nervous system. It is the function of the central nervous system that helps us to experience the environment. Now, I'm not trying to teach you medicine or biology or anything like that, but I think it's very important for us to understand a couple of very important aspects of this body that we have. What goes on in this body? Because if you understand this, you will begin to really understand why sometimes you react in the way that you do. So the central nervous system is made of two parts: the brain and the spinal cord. What happens is that the spinal cord is connected to the rest of the body through this peripheral nervous system, which is connected to all our sense organs. That means the eyeball is connected to optic nerves, and the optic nerves is the part of the peripheral nervous system, and that optic nerves go through the spinal cord and reaches the brain. So what happens is when we see something, that is because light enter the eye and stimulate the light sensitive cells in the retina. And this stimulation causes signals to be sent to the brain. And then the brain processes the signal, and this processing of the signal is the activity of the mind. And then the mind either makes a decision consciously, or the mind may react unconsciously. And these are sent down as messages down these nerves through the spinal cord to the rest of the body to react. It sends instructions to your hand to move your hand, because you want to pick up this bottle, so you move your hand. So all these are signals being sent by the brain to the peripheral nervous system, causing your body to react. So the brain is a very important aspect of this central nervous system. It receives information from our sense organ, it processes it, and then it sends instructions and messages down to our muscles and glands to react. So this is really what is happening moment to moment, continuously, whether you are awake or you're asleep. Even when you're asleep, the brain doesn't sleep. The brain is still working. Your senses are not really sleeping. Your senses are still working even when you sleep. Because if your senses are not working, then you will not be able to wake up when the alarm goes off. Because when the alarm goes off, you can hear it. That means your hearing was working even when you were sleeping. So your senses actually never sleep. Even your eye doesn't sleep. When your eyelids are closed, somebody turns on a bright light or shines a torch at your eye, you will wake up. Because it stimulates the light-sensitive cells at the back of the retina even when your eyes are closed. Light can get through the eyelid. A little bit of light can get through. So that is really what happens with this central nervous system. Now we need to take a slightly closer look at the brain itself, because it's very important to understand one particular part of the brain which is responsible for a lot of our emotional reactions. It is responsible for this thing called tanha, which is translated as craving. If we take a quick look at a dissection of what the brain looks like, the brain has evolved over millions of years into three major layers. The oldest layer is the brain stem at the bottom, and this is the part that keeps us alive. This is the part that controls our digestion, our heart rate, our respiration, blood pressure, and body temperature. So this keeps us alive. That is why that part of the brain is called the survival brain. Then the next part that is evolved, the next ancient part that is evolved is called the limbic system. And this is the part of the brain responsible for our emotional arousal and emotional reaction. In fact, this is our emotional brain. So our brain, there is a part of our brain that is actually the emotional brain. And then the outermost is the most recently evolved layer, which is called the cerebral cortex. This layer of brain actually comes in different names. Different scientists refer to different parts of it and calls it by different name. Another name of that part of the brain is called cortex. Another name is also called cerebrum. And then another name is also called neocortex. But they're all referring more or less the same outermost part of your brain. Now this is the part of the brain responsible for thinking. This is the part of the brain where you have your intelligence, your intellect. Your thinking is going on in this outermost part of the brain. Your emotion is going on in the inner part called limbic system. So this thinking brain, cerebral cortex, is actually commonly called the learning brain. The word learning instead of thinking, because learning means you're able to remember. So when you remember something and you recall something, that is a learning process. So this is the three parts of your brain. But we're going to focus on the middle part, the part that is responsible for emotional arousal and emotional reaction. So let's take just a little bit closer look at it. In this limbic system, the emotional brain, it's called the emotional command center in your brain. Buried deep inside this emotional brain, the limbic system, is a small little tissue on each hemisphere. See, our brain is made of two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Within each of the hemisphere, there is a small little tissue called the amygdala. Remember this word, it is very important. A-M-Y-G-D-A-L-A, amygdala. The amygdala is a very powerful little tissue inside your brain. It is actually responsible for very severe reactions, responsible for a lot of your emotional reaction. Now what does the amygdala do? The The amygdala is continuously sensing all the activities coming in from your sense organ. That means every time you see something, you hear something, you taste something, you smell something, or you touch something, that information goes through the amygdala. The amygdala scans that information, and what does it scan for? It is looking for signs of threats. The amygdala is there to protect you. So the amygdala is scanning all your sensory inputs to see if there is anything that resembles danger to you. And what happens when it senses something that resembles danger? It causes a biochemical chain reaction. And this reaction is basically called the fight or flight reaction. So when the amygdala senses signals that appear to raise an alarm that it might be danger to the organism, it causes this stress reaction. And it is this stress reaction that leads to our suffering. So therefore, it is very important to understand the amygdala is the one that reacts and causes a lot of suffering. Now, the amygdala has a very interesting paradoxical role. Two paradoxical roles. That means there are two roles that seem to work in opposite direction. But first, it acts like a bodyguard. It is checking and our senses, our sense organs, to see if we sense danger. So what kind of danger is it sensing? The amygdala is not intelligent. The amygdala is not able to think. The amygdala is not able to analyze what it is picking up. So what can raise an alarm that there is danger? Alright? The amygdala is very simple and primitive. When it picks up loud noise, it then treats that as danger. When it picks up bright light coming from the eye, then it is treated as danger. When it picks up heat, high temperature or extreme low temperature coming from the body, when you touch something very hot or you touch something very cold, that is also treated as danger. And when you taste something very bitter or something very sour, something very spicy, that is also danger. Or you smell something very pungent, right? Very bad smell, that is also treated as danger. So all these are signals that arouse the amygdala and say there is danger out there. And then the amygdala begins to react. Now those conditions I described to you are basically legitimate danger. But then it is also possible that there are signals which are not real danger. Take for example, you have a friend who happens to have a very loud voice. He likes to speak with a loud voice. And then he walks up to you and then suddenly he speaks in a very loud voice and says, "Hello, how are you?" Now that kind of loud voice can trigger an arousal of the amygdala and cause a stress reaction in you. So it is a very innocent thing that has just happened, and yet the amygdala is aroused. So that is the other paradoxical role of the amygdala. The way it reacts, it actually can be like a terrorist to you. It reacts very negatively to some of these signals. Another example of this danger signal is that you might be sitting there peacefully reading a book and not paying attention to what's going on around you, and suddenly a friend comes from behind you and tap you on the shoulder, and then suddenly you are spooked. Then that jumping, that spooking reaction, that is the work of the amygdala. The amygdala senses a touch sensation when it does not expect it. When your body is peaceful and then suddenly it senses a touch sensation, the amygdala interprets it as danger and causes bodily reaction. What kind of bodily reaction? It actually causes the release of hormones. And hormones flood the body through the bloodstream, and it floods the body and it goes to different organs and causes the different organs to react. It causes your heart to beat faster. It causes your lungs to breathe more rapidly. It causes your body temperature to rise. It causes your muscle to tense up and a whole lot of other reactions. So the amygdala has these two paradoxical roles. So now that you know, very often Your emotions are aroused because the amygdala has detected some kind of a threat. And it also causes suffering in the body. It causes this pain and suffering, dukkha, right? Because these bodily sensations, bodily reactions can be suffering. So the next time you experience suffering, you can actually say, don't blame me, blame my amygdala. Okay? So that is the amygdala, and that is what it does. Remember this word because it's very important to understand, right, from a scientific perspective, how we experience suffering. So I'm going to explain further, and later on I will point out to you, even the Buddha has mentioned something similar to this. Okay, the Buddha has actually described the process of the mind using 3 words. Right? Very commonly he uses 3 words to describe the 3 parts of a mental experience. The first part of the mental experience, he calls it vijnana. Vijnana is actually the product of process of perception. Process of perception is actually a very straightforward explanation of this process called the panchakanda, or what is commonly translated as 5 aggregates. So this 5 aggregates actually results in the arising of vijnana. And vijnana is actually commonly translated as consciousness. Now this is where I like to point out, my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, he is actually a man of science. He has studied this and he has basically explained the translation of vijnana is more accurate to call it perception, because consciousness in the scientific field has a different meaning. It is not just awareness. The word consciousness in psychology and in neuroscience refers to the awareness of a self in a world, the awareness of the atta, the self, in a world, which is the loka. And this whole process of awareness is actually much more complicated than being aware of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting and touching. Because this sense of awareness, this consciousness, actually is far more complicated than awareness of a sensory perception. So therefore, vijnana is more accurately translated as perception, not consciousness. Because consciousness includes the notion that there is a self, right, to be affected by what is happening in the environment, right? The delusion of a self. That is the meaning of consciousness in the scientific field, in psychology and in neuroscience. That's what they mean when they say consciousness, awareness of a self in an environment or in the world. So vijnana is the first part of this mental experience. Then the Buddha actually describes how the mind works using 2 other words. Now it is the process of the mind. Vijnana is actually the process of the sense organs and the central nervous system. Not so much the mind, but the central nervous system, the sense organs that leads to vijnana. Inside the brain, all the brain activity is actually the process of the mind. And the Buddha used 2 words to describe this process of the mind. The first word he uses is mano. Mano is actually the intellectual process, what the scientists commonly call cognitive process or cognition. That means the ability to interpret your sensory perceptions. So it is an interpretation of perceived objects, which then lets you give meaning to what was perceived. And when you give meaning to what was perceived, you give it a label or a name. So what you have perceived arises as a mental image. And this mental image is called rupa. And this mental image, you begin to interpret it and give it a meaning. And the meaning you give to it, you assign a name or a label to it. And the name or the label you give to it is called nama. So therefore you have nama, rupa arising in your mind. Rupa is the mental image of what you have perceived, what you have seen, heard, smelled, taste or touch is a mental image arising. Because the word rupa even in Pali, actually means an image or an appearance. And for those of you who are familiar with Bahasa Melayu, you will also know rupa means appearance, right? It doesn't mean form, actually. So my teacher translate rupa as appearance or mental image or image. Now this interpretation process is actually part of the cognitive process, and therefore the Buddha described that cognitive process as mano. Mano is also the process where you are able to think rationally. Right? This is the mano process, the rational thinking. That's why the word we use there, the common word is intellect, the intelligence that you have, the ability to think rationally and logically. That is mano. But there is another part of the mind, which is the emotional part of the mind. And the Buddha uses the word chitta. Now chitta is actually the emotional part of the mind. It is emotions. And the scientific term for this is called affective process. Right? So therefore this chitta is actually aroused by pleasant, unpleasant or neutral feelings whenever you see, hear, smell, taste or touch something. And these feelings then trigger an emotional arousal. The emotional arousal leads to mental proliferation. And this mental proliferation, you begin to recall memory, imagination, expectation, and you begin to make a decision what you want to do. So this process is a very emotional process. And when that happens, we begin to personalize this experience. And the personalization of this experience eventually leads to the notion that there is a self to be affected. So every time our sense organ is stimulated by the environment, we are able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. So when we see something, what happens in the mind? The mind says, I see a dog out there. You see? The mind automatically says, I see this, I see that. And therefore the mind is actually creating the notion there is an I. By breaking that experience into two parts. The subjective part, which is internal to the body, and the objective part, which is what is happening out there. So therefore, that breaking up is actually causing you to personalize what is going on inside the body. This process of personalization, the Pali word for that is called upadana. And this upadana is often translated as clinging, and some call it attachment. Right? So then this is the process called clinging. But my teacher actually uses a more precise word. It is called personalization. And this personalization creates the notion there is a self. But the reality of what happens is there is only an experience. There is no self. So there should not be any personalization. What you experience is very impersonal. What is impersonal is anatta. Right? So there is no self. But somehow the mind likes to break that experience into two parts. What is inside the body is a subjective experience. What is outside the body is the objective experience. The subjective experience is the atta, and that's why it thinks there is a self. And the objective experience is the loka. There's a world out there, right? So it breaks that experience, and that is how it leads to various suffering that we are experiencing. And this leads to our reaction, volitional reaction. We begin to think we want to do something. The thinking of wanting to do something is actually the volition, and volition is called cetana, or some call it intention. And because we have an intention to do something, we carry out the action, and that action is called karma. The action that you take is called karma. And when you take action, you create consequences. You cause something to happen. That thing that happens, the thing that you cause to happen, the result or the consequence of your action is called vipaka. So we're going to examine all this process in a moment, how it happens, and going through the flow chart of how all this happens inside your mind that leads to your reaction and the consequence. So let's take a look at this process of experience then. The process of experience is actually a chain reaction. That means it is not something that happened one time. No. It is continuously going on moment to moment, endlessly, non-stop. Because your eye is constantly picking up light. Your ear is constantly picking up sound. Your nose is constantly smelling, and your tongue is constantly tasting. Even if it is not tasting food outside, it is tasting something inside your mouth. And your body is constantly in contact with something. You're not floating in the air. And therefore, all your five senses is constantly working continuously, non-stop. That's why it's called a chain reaction. So let's take a look at how that works. The environment will stimulate your five sense organs, the five physical sense organs. And these five physical sense organs, they are your eye, your ears, your nose, your tongue, and your body. And when it is stimulated, the Panchakanda arises, or what is commonly translated as the five aggregates. But my teacher likes to translate Panchakanda as the process of perception, because it gives rise to this vijnana. And this vijnana is the big picture of what you have just seen, heard, smell, taste, and touch. Vijnana is actually not the little things that you're seeing. It's the whole image, the whole experience that you're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. So the correct term for vijnana is perception. You now have a perception of something out there which stimulated your sense organs. Therefore, it allows you to see, to hear, to smell, to taste, and to touch. Your five sense organs are working. Now when these five sense organs working, your sixth sense also works, because you have six sensual realms. The sixth sense is your mind. But actually it's not just the word mind. Mind is a big word, because if you try to understand what is the word mind, it can be very complex to try to understand. It is best to understand what aspect of the mind we are talking about. Are we talking about the cognitive process, or are we talking about the affective process? There are two processes in your mind. The cognitive process, which is the thinking mind, right? That means the rational thinking, the intelligence, the intellect. And the affective process, which is the emotional process of your mind. So let's take a look at what happens when you begin to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. And what happens is that your cognitive process arises, right? Mano arises to interpret what has been seen, heard, smell, taste, and touch. And in the process of the Panchakanda, when it is actually receiving these sensory stimulations from the environment, there is the Vedana that arises in the Panchakanda. Vedana is the feeling. And that feeling is that whatever you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch can be either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, or what is called neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Right? So these three conditions of that feeling actually triggers the arousal of your emotions. Therefore, it actually triggers the arising of chitta. Chitta is actually the emotional process, and the scientific term is called affective process, because it affects your mind, it affects your body, it affects everything that is in this organism. So therefore, your mind has three mental experiences. Vijnana, because of your sense organs; mano, because of your intellect; and chitta, because of your emotions. These are the three parts of your mental experiences. And when chitta arises, it actually triggers an unconscious emotional arousal that causes biochemical reactions in the body. So in other words, every time you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch something, it causes some kind of a biochemical chain reaction in the body. Hormones begin to be released, and then various organs begin to react, and that causes tension in the body. So when these hormones affect the organs, different organs in the body begin to react, and you actually have the bodily sensation. the feeling of pain, the feeling of discomfort, right? Physical discomfort, physical pain, right? So in other words, this part of your affective process or this part of your emotional experience is a physical part of the experience. Emotional experience comes in two parts, physical and mental. So this is the physiological part. The other one, the mental part, is the psychological part. So this physiological part disturbs the body, putting tension in the body, and then there is bodily sensation. This bodily sensation is actually a form of dukkha, a kind of physical feeling which is uncomfortable. Right? And this is affecting your thinking mind, affecting your mano. So therefore it disturbs your mano. Your bodily sensation disturbs your thinking mind, disturbs your rational thinking, and then you're not able to think rationally. So this is the physiological disturbance, commonly called stress, bodily stress. Stress also comes in two flavors, physical and mental. So this is the physical stress. But when people talk about stress, most of the time it all begins with physical stress. So this is the part which is physical, your physiological disturbance. And this is causing the suffering to arise. It causes the arousal of sukha and parideva. And sukha is commonly translated as grief. Parideva is commonly translated as mourning and lamentation. Right? So all this will arise, and this arising begins to cause a mental part of the suffering. So in other words, it's the physical part of the suffering that leads to mental suffering. Physical suffering starts first. See, until about 100 odd years ago, scientists in those days, psychologists in those days did not quite understand these hormonal reactions in the body. They thought emotion is purely mental. Even today, there are a lot of people who think emotion is purely mental, but it is not. Emotions begin as a physical disturbance, and this physical disturbance in an untrained mind leads to mental disturbance. So now we move on and take a look at the mental disturbance. This physical disturbance is described in psychology as general adaptation syndrome stage 1, which is called alarm reaction. It so happened this endocrinologist who discovered this and explained this about 60, 70 years ago, his name is Hans Selye. He described the process of stress very thoroughly and very accurately, describing the hormonal reactions in the body. And it so happens the way he described it corresponds precisely to the Buddha's description of sukha and parideva. Right? This is called the alarm reaction. You begin to feel something terrible and you really want to cry, you want to moan, and this is grief and lamentation. So let's take a look at that physical part. What happens?
Fear is so important for our survival, we do something absolutely remarkable. Our bodies begin to react to a threat before we're even consciously aware of what the threat might be. Because when we're faced with danger, milliseconds count. At the first hint of danger, early warning signals are sent to the brain via the optic nerve, to our tiny and primitive fear center, the amygdala. This prepares our body for action. Next, nerve pulses are fired down the spinal cord to the adrenal glands near our kidneys. This triggers a release of adrenaline. Now we're on full alert. Adrenaline is the vital hormone that can flood our body in a split second. As it reaches our lungs, we breathe more deeply and take in more oxygen. It also makes our heart beat faster. Oxygen-rich blood is diverted to our muscles. They are now charged springs, waiting for the signal to run or fight. All this before our conscious mind has even registered a threat. This reaction to fear has evolved over millions of years and is known as the fight or flight response.
So this is the fight or flight reaction, and it has evolved over millions of years. It causes hormones to flood our body. So let's take a look at this process, how this physical part of the emotion arises. So as I mentioned earlier, emotions, there are two aspects of emotion. The first one I have just described is the physiological aspect of emotion. The other aspect of emotion is psychological aspect of emotion, the mental part of emotion. And emotion actually has two activities. The first is arousal. That means emotions become aroused. And in that process of arousal, it causes physical reactions. And this physical reaction disturbs the mind. Now you have mental arousal. And mental arousal leads to reactions. So arousal and reaction are the two activities of your emotion. So now let's take a look at the other aspect of your emotions, right? First, we have seen the physiological arousal. Physiological arousal is this feeling of sensations, the feeling from your sense organs, whether it is something pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, or what we call neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So this is a physiological arousal, and that leads to mental arousal. That mental arousal in chitta actually brings up the memory, brings up imagination, brings up expectation. And when memory, imagination, expectation arises, it begins to react to pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant sensations. And this reaction actually causes these defilements called lobha, dosa, and moha. When pleasant sensations are detected, it makes you feel good. And this pleasant and feeling good makes you want more of that. So in other words, you begin to lust for something pleasurable, something pleasant. The lust for something pleasant leads to the greed. And this lust and greed is lobha. Now when you experience something unpleasant or painful, it causes you to want to reject it. You want to avoid it. So there is an aversion towards these unpleasant sensations. Or there's a hatred of that pain. You don't want it. You want to get rid of it. You hate it. Right? So this aversion and hatred is called dosa. And whenever you experience these sensations, your mind begins to cling to that experience. Your mind begins to personalize that experience. That clinging leads to the delusion that there is a self that is being affected. You see, when we knock our hand against the wall, the hand feels pain. But what do we say inside our mind? Do we say, this hand feels pain? No. What do we say? My hand feels pain. We personalize that experience as my. Similarly, we see something, we say, I see, right? That I, the my, that is the delusion of the self. This delusion of the self is moha. Right? So you have lobha, dosa, and moha, the defilements that arise. This defilement is actually the mental part of your emotional reaction. Right? So this is the psychological arousal, and that leads to a physical reaction. So this psychological arousal, lobha, dosa, and moha, this is the mental defilements that first arise, leads to mental proliferation. What is mental proliferation? Mental proliferation is when the memory, the imagination, the expectation begin to play havoc in your mind. It begins to imagine something getting out of control. It begins to imagine something worse than what it really is. Expectation, you have a desire to want to get rid of something painful. You have a desire of wanting more of something pleasurable. So all that is expectations. So these are mental proliferation. Mental proliferation actually are various forms of defilements. Okay? So this is really what is happening in your mind. And when this mental proliferation arises, what does it do? It actually disturbs your thinking process, disturbs your mano. So in other words, when the chitta arises and gives rise to this mental proliferation, you have this psychological arousal. It begins to disturb your cognitive process. It disturbs your intellect, your intelligence. You are not able to think clearly, not able to think straight. Now, that is what is going on. Now take a look at all the arrows pointing to mano. On the top, you have physical disturbance. On the right hand side, you have mental disturbance. So they are disturbing your mano. So now let's take a look at this physical reaction. What has actually happened? When you see, hear, smell, taste and touch something, the pleasant and unpleasant sensations causes the arousal of the amygdala, and the amygdala reacts. So the amygdala in the brain begins to send message to glands, various glands in the body, by sending signals through your nerves to the glands. And these glands begin to react. So one of the glands that react is the adrenal gland. There are two adrenal glands, one on each side of the body, and they are located directly above your kidney. Immediately above your kidney, on each side of your body, is the adrenal gland. So you have two adrenal glands. And what happens when the adrenal gland is aroused by the amygdala? The adrenal gland releases two very powerful hormones. It's called adrenaline and cortisol. These two hormones disturb the rest of the body in various ways. They flood the body by going through your bloodstream. So it flows through your blood, carried to various organs in your body, and begin to disturb the various organs of the body in a very specific way, because these are very specific hormones. When it reaches your heart, what does it do? It causes your heart to beat faster. So in other words, when you get excited, when you are angry, when you become fearful, your heart beats faster. That's because of these hormones. So your heart beats faster, pumping blood in a more harder way. And when it pumps blood in such a hard way, it causes your blood pressure to rise. It increases your blood circulation. So your temperature, your body temperature rises, because your blood circulation now becomes like a highway speeding very fast. Okay? When these hormones reach your lungs, what do the hormones do? They cause your lungs to breathe rapidly. Respiration deepens, and this is necessary to increase oxygen intake, because oxygen is needed for the cells in your body to react to danger. And when it reaches other parts of your body, like your intestines, it actually suspends intestinal movement. Why does it do that? Because when you have consumed food, the one part of your body that draws a lot of energy from the rest of your body is the digestive system. The digestive system draws so much energy from the rest of the body, it even draws energy from your brain. So this is why after a heavy meal, you feel very sleepy. This is because a lot of energy has been diverted to your digestive system. So your brain is not getting enough energy through the oxygen. So your brain is not getting enough oxygen, you feel drowsy and groggy. That's why we become like that. For those of you who had a very heavy dinner before you came to this talk, this is precisely what you're feeling right now. A little bit drowsy, a little bit groggy, yawning away. Okay? And then, when adrenaline reaches your muscles, it causes your muscle to tense up. And your muscle becomes all tensed up. Right now, every one of you is experiencing this. You know why? Because the temperature is so cold. Your bodily sensation says to your brain, it is too cold. And then your amygdala reacts. You see, your amygdala is sending hormones in your body, causing various sensations in your body. Some of you are feeling tingling sensations, aren't you? that tingling sensation is because of these hormones. Then the next thing that happens is it causes your hair to stand on end, it causes your pupil to dilate, that means you're able to see more because the amygdala is very wise in this case. It senses danger, it causes your eyes to pick up more light to see what is going on. And it causes your facial expression to distort. You see, when somebody becomes stressed, whether he is anxious or he is angry or he is fearful, right, his facial expression distorts. You see, you don't find people who are angry or fearful looking very calm and peaceful. That doesn't happen. Angry people, they look like that, you know. Facial expression distorts, and you begin to experience perspiration in some cases, trembling, in some cases body temperature rises, and in some cases various bodily sensations, uncomfortable bodily sensations. And finally, these hormones cause other things to happen. It causes blood sugar level to rise in order to convert stored energy to active energy, because the amygdala senses danger. So it actually wakes up the body to react to danger, causing a lot of tension in the body, a lot of stress in the body. And it is actually releasing a lot of, raising this blood sugar level to convert stored energy into active energy to fight against the threat. And it also suspends the body immune system. Now take a look at all these things. Is it healthy or not healthy? Is suspension of your body immune system a healthy thing? You better be careful nobody got Ebola coming by, because you're going to catch it very easily if your body immune system is suspended. Blood sugar level rises, what happens? You become diabetic. Perspiration, trembling, body temperature rises, what happens? It causes your body to shake. And you shake too much when you get old, you might actually get Parkinson's disease. And your facial expression gets distorted. What happens? You begin to have lines in your face, we call them railway tracks. Actually, you can see, I don't mean anyone, any disrespect to anyone. Take a look at people who are not too old. When I say not too old, people who are up to maybe 50, 60 years old. Past 60, then we say ola. Below 60, not ola. I'm young, I'm just 59, that's why I use 60 as not ola, so I'm still young. Look at people at that age. If you find a lot of lines in their face, they have had a very emotional life. That is really what happened. You can tell a person who has emotional life. That's why you can see people who have had a very happy life, a blessed life, even when they're 50 and 60, you can still see the skin very smooth. They're always smiling. They are smiling because a different hormone comes out, and that hormone actually causes the skin to be very smooth. That hormone is called endorphin. Right? Not adrenaline, not cortisol. Right? So now you can see how the body is unhealthy because of all this. So now the mind is disturbed by bodily sensations and mental proliferation. So therefore emotions has these two parts, physiological and psychological. That means physical and mental. The physical part, the suffering, is called dukkha, because we have talked about sukha and parideva. Then the next two aspects of suffering is dukkha and domanassa. Dukkha refers to the physical suffering, and domanassa refers to the mental suffering. So now you have two forms of suffering that you are experiencing. And when this is happening, when dukkha and domanassa is happening, it is disturbing your thinking mind. And this disturbance is causing an internal war going on. Tug of war going on between your thinking and your feeling. That means between your emotions and your intellect. They are pulling in opposite direction. This pulling in opposite direction causes a lot of confusion, causes a lot of doubt, causes a lot of skepticism, causes a lot of anger and various things. This is actually vicikiccha. Vicikiccha is translated as skeptical doubt, but I'll show you later. Actually, there is a scientific term for vicikiccha. We'll come to that later. So when that is happening, right, you have this pain, and you have this depression, the physical suffering and the mental suffering. These two again correspond to what this Hans Selye was describing as general adaptation syndrome stage 2, which is resistance, the stage of resistance. Now you begin to want to react, you want to resist what is going on. You are making decisions what to do now. So this is actually the result of having experienced dukkha and domanassa. So I mentioned to you vicikicca, when thinking and feeling are pulling in opposite direction. So you have feeling and thinking pulling in opposite direction. The feeling comes from your affective process, your emotions. Right? This is from your chitta, the chitta aspect of your mental experience. The thinking is reasoning. That means rational thinking, reasoning what is right, what is wrong, judgment of what is good and what is bad. That comes from your intellect, your cognitive process, the mano aspect of your mental experience. When they begin to pull in different direction, you then begin to want to react. Now, you know, most of the time when you are torn between something rational and something emotional, most of the time, almost 99% of the time, which makes you make a decision? Do you make decision based on rational thinking, or usually do you make a decision usually based on emotional feeling? Which one has a stronger pull? Which one makes you decide? For most of you, untrained mind, intellect or emotions? It's your emotion. Now, don't worry. It's not your fault. It is in your brain. Your brain empowers the emotional part of the brain. That's why when emotions and rash reasoning arise, emotion almost always win because of the structure of your brain. You need to train your mind to overcome that. And the training of the mind is called bhavana, cultivation or meditation, to help you overcome that. If not, you will always be succumbing to emotions. You will always react emotionally if you don't train your mind. In an untrained mind, the mental disturbance will cause your decisions to be skewed towards emotions. Now, we're very wise, you know, humans are very smart people. When feeling and reasoning are pulling in opposite direction, this process of pulling, scientifically it is called cognitive dissonance. This is a psychological term, which means your emotion is pulling in one direction, your intellect is pulling in the other direction. So you have feeling and reasoning pulling in opposite direction. That is causing disturbance in your mind. This disturbance is called cognitive dissonance, and that is actually vicikicca. Vicikicca is commonly translated as skeptical doubt. That is a very simplistic translation. The more accurate and more precise translation of vicikicca is cognitive dissonance, which is what I explained here. When feelings and reasoning pull in opposite directions, we experience vicikicca, and we invariably react according to feelings. And then we're very smart. We justify our emotionally charged decisions to react with very clever reasoning. I will give you a simple example. How many of you love to eat or really enjoy eating durian? Don't be afraid. Raise your hand. So many. Everyone, Bante included. Right? You enjoy durian. Can you tell me one rational explanation why durian is good for you? No. There is none. Some people say, oh, it is high in antioxidant. No. There are fruits that have much higher antioxidant that cause a fraction of durian. Some people say, oh, it is high in vitamin. No. That same fruit I'm describing is high in vitamin. Some people will say, oh, because it has a lot of fiber. No. The fruit that I'm specifically pointing to has even more fiber, and it costs 1/fraction of durian. In fact, the fruit I'm referring to does not contain sugar. It is low. It has no cholesterol, no sugar, low in salt, and very high in antioxidant, very high in fiber. And it is one of the cheaper fruits around compared to durian. Which fruit do you think I'm referring to? The English word for it is called chicken shit fruit. Translated to Chinese. 雞屎果, it's guava. Yeah? And yet we love to eat durian. You should eat more guava. Guava is a lot more healthy for you. But why? Why do you like durian? People are giving all this kind of reasoning. See, this clever reasoning is called justification. Yeah? Everybody will say, oh, it is high in fiber, it is high in antioxidants, so on and so forth. If you want something high in fiber, high in antioxidant, eat guava. Don't eat durian. And yet, you prefer durian, yes or not? I also lah. So this is actually what is going on in the mind. Don't blame yourself. It is the structure of your brain that causes your emotion to take control of your thinking process. And this is an explanation from the neuroscientists. The man who discovered a lot of things happening in the amygdala, that scientist is actually Joseph Ledoux. That is his name, a French name, but he's actually American, Joseph Ledoux. And he's featured inside this, explaining about the amygdala. He's the world's foremost scientist that discovered a lot of things going on in the amygdala.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, turn!
And when we try to control them, we start a tug of war between our brain's oldest and newest parts. While ancient structures like the amygdala respond to threats by trying to turn our anger or fear on, it's newer structures, such as the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, that try to turn them off. It's the tug of war between these two systems that gives rise to our emotions. At New York University, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has studied how the amygdala and the cortex shape our emotional responses. You know more about the amygdala than anybody alive, and you still can't control yours.
No.
Why?
Now, there's an interesting thing, again, that has to do with the wiring of the brain. This is, if we could just look at it here. So this is the human brain inside a skull. And the prefrontal cortex is here in the front, right behind your forehead. And that is the newest part of the brain. This is where we make our decisions, this is where we plan for the future and strategize. The lateral prefrontal cortex has no connectivity with the amygdala. The amygdala has superhighways to talk to the cortex, but the prefrontal cortex has only back roads and side streets to get to the amygdala. And therefore, it is unable to tell the amygdala, cool it.
But why are there no connections?
We're in the process of evolving as we speak, and those connections have not been put in yet. This thing was built to do fancy things cognitively, not necessarily to control our emotions.
Now you see why. The emotional part of your brain actually has very strong connections going to the thinking part of your brain. See, your thinking part of the brain is in the frontal lobe. This is where you do most of your thinking and reasoning. Deep inside is your emotional brain. The amygdala is the emotional command center. And the connections from the amygdala to your thinking brain is very strong. Which means each time the amygdala is aroused, it is sending a lot of messages to sabotage your thinking process. That is what's going on. You are not able to think clearly because the amygdala is sending a lot of messages sabotaging your thinking. At the same time, your thinking brain has very weak connections going back to the emotional command center. Therefore, your thinking brain is not able to calm the amygdala. Your thinking brain cannot overcome the power of the amygdala. So therefore, the next time you get aroused, don't say that, oh, I'm getting aroused. No. Blame it on your amygdala. So that is really what is happening. Your amygdala is very powerful. Therefore, it is very important. The Buddha has taught us, it is very important to practice bhavana, cultivation, and this is meditation. It's only through meditation you can actually train your thinking brain to become stronger, to actually fortify your ability to think rationally. And scientists have proven it. People who meditate, The thinking brain, the very small part of it is called the prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain becomes strongly reinforced. Right? Maybe in one of the future Dhamma sharing, if I get to come back, I will explain more about how meditation affects the brain, because that is very important. But meanwhile, we just carry on with this topic today. So that is disturbing, and that causes you to want to do something. Wanting to do something is volition. Now you actually want to do something, and this one thing is caused by your emotions. This one thing is caused by your lobha, your dosa, and your moha. Right? Your wanting, your lust and greed, your aversion and hatred for unpleasant sensations, and ignorance and delusion of the self. And all this leads to these experiences, the 8 worldly conditions that you are experiencing. You want to have gain, but you don't want loss. You want to have fame, but you don't want to have ill repute or ill fame. You want to have praise, but you don't want blame. And you want more pleasure, and you don't want pain. Right? Basically, these are the 8 worldly conditions that makes you want that. Right? And this is volition. Volition is cetana. Right? When you have volition, you then act out your volition. You take the action to do something about it. The action you take is called karma. Right? So this is the unskillful action. If you are not thinking clearly, that means you are reacting based on emotions. It is unskillful, and they actually create consequences. Consequence is vipaka, the result from your action. Now, the Western world, unfortunately, has translated karma incorrectly. A lot of Westerners use the word karma to mean vipaka. A lot of people say, when you do something, the result is, oh, this is your karma. But what they're referring to is the vipaka, the consequence that is created. But Westerners do not understand these Pali terms so well, and they easily mistake karma as vipaka. So when they refer to consequences, they call it karma. So this is a misrepresentation by the Western world, because the consequence is vipaka. So the Buddha has pointed out there are 2 kinds of suffering. And the Buddha has mentioned it. For untrained worldlings, right, emotional arousal gives rise to 2 kinds of suffering. Physical as well as mental. Right? In other words, your emotions begin to react. And this emotional reaction is tanha, which is commonly translated as craving, but my teacher translated as emotional reaction. I hope by now, having seen what I've explained, you will understand tanha to mean emotional reaction is a more precise translation here. And the Buddha further explained, for trained disciples, that means people who train their mind, people who cultivate their mind, they practice bhavana. Right? Emotional arousal give rise to only one kind of suffering, which is the physical suffering. The mind does not proliferate. That means the mental suffering does not arise. Only the physical suffering arises. And this is explained in Samyutta Nikaya 36.6 in the sutra called Salata Sutta, or translated as the dart by Bhikkhu Bodhi. So you can read this, go home and read this, and you will understand that there are 2 kinds of suffering. People who don't cultivate their mind, they experience 2 kinds of suffering: physical suffering and emotional or mental suffering. People who train their mind, they don't experience mental suffering, which means people who train their mind, they are less likely to go into depression. Right? Depression is the severe mental suffering. Right? So in other words, if you train your mind, you practice meditation, you are less likely to experience depression. So every reaction has a consequence. What kind of consequence? What is vipaka? There are 2 kinds of vipaka: internal and external. Internal vipaka, right, we can actually compare it to what Hans Selye described as stress, the general adaptation syndrome. I mentioned to you, he pointed out 3 stages: alarm reaction, stage of resistance, and stage of exhaustion. And the Buddha also pointed out, basically, Buddha actually mentioned it very clearly. This alarm reaction is Soka and Parideva. This stage of resistance is Dukkha and Domanassa. And this stage of exhaustion, when you finally give up, when you actually go into deep depression and distress, that is Upayasa. So basically these are these 5 levels of suffering that you experience. This is the internal consequence to reacting emotionally. What are the external consequences, right, in relation to the opposite party? That means the person you deal with, you are affecting your relationship with that person. In relation to society, that means you are affecting all the people around you. In relation to the law of the land, sometimes you do things that is against the law, break the law. You get so angry, you drive at the traffic light and you see the traffic light turn from amber to red. You don't care, you just want to charge through because you're so angry, you want to rush somewhere. So that can cause you to break the law of the land. In relation to environment, sometimes we destroy environment, like the riots. You see people go on riots, right? They are destroying the environment. Or in relation to matters arising after death. And this is what a lot of people commonly term as karma and rebirth. In other words, your emotional reaction can cause a lot of consequences in your life, and these consequences can lead to your final moment when you die. Where and how you get reborn is very much affected by all the karma that you have been exercising throughout your life, right? Of course, including the accumulation of past life. But this is number 5 in relation to matters arising after death, your rebirth. So how can we overcome this? Very quickly, I won't go too deep. I'll just give you one simple little tip on it. Peace of mind is a mind free from mental proliferation. When we experience these sensory perceptions and then they begin to cause bodily reaction, you have to cultivate your mind and cultivate mindfulness. Be mindful of your bodily conditions. So in other words, the first hint, the first tip I want to give you to help you become more peaceful person, pay attention to your bodily conditions. Every time something happens, something exciting or something painful or something pleasurable, something happens, ask yourself what is going on in your body. How is your body reacting? So be mindful of your bodily conditions. In what way do you have to be mindful? Take a look at your heart rate. Is your heart beating faster? Anytime you feel that your heart is beating faster, right, the palpitation pumping away, something has aroused your emotion. Be wary of your reaction after that, because you are now emotionally charged, emotionally aroused. So pay attention to your heart rate, pay attention to your breathing. Because when your breathing deepens and you go into hyperventilation, like that kind of breathing, you know something is arousing your emotions very strongly. Pay attention to your muscle tension. Your fists all tensing up. Is your muscle all tensed up? You're feeling neck ache and all that. When you begin to feel this tension, something has aroused your emotion. Pay attention to your bodily temperature. Are you feeling hot? You suddenly feel, a little fever coming, right? Or pay attention to your own facial expression. Do you find yourself clenching your teeth? Do you find yourself all tensed up in your face? Something has aroused your emotion. Pay attention to your voice. Is your voice actually becoming louder? Are you now suddenly getting louder? Or in some cases, the pitch of your voice rises. You know, when people get excited, the pitch of the voice rises, right? So pay attention to that. Pay attention to your fist and your arm. Are they all fisted up, right? That means something is arousing your emotion. And finally, pay attention. Are you perspiring unnecessarily? So these are the important bodily conditions you pay attention to. Now this mindfulness is actually the first foundation of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Satipatthana. This is actually your mindfulness of the body. Kayanupassana. This is being aware of what goes on in your body, how your body is reacting. Now, I'm not going to explain further about Satipatthana. I'll just basically point to the first foundation. Right? This is the first foundation of mindfulness. So pay attention to your bodily conditions. When you do that and you realize something has happened, it has aroused your emotion, what should you do? Pause and relax before you react. Right? Because when something has aroused your emotion, your mental proliferation arises. All the defilements begin to come up. You begin to have all sorts of defilements arising, disturbing your thinking process. So now is the time you must use your thinking process. Now, if you have been practicing meditation, you can do this. But for most people who have not been practicing meditation, it's very difficult for them to actually become mindful. Right? So when you are mindful, use the power of your thinking to force yourself to pause and relax. When you pause and relax and think before you react, you are now able to react in a more sensible, more rational, and more peaceful and wholesome way. So therefore, use your consciousness to help you. Your awareness of your environment, your awareness of yourself to help you. And this awareness you can cultivate through the cultivation of Satipatthana. So practice meditation. That first foundation is Kayanupassana. So you pay attention to your bodily conditions. When you do that, it actually stops your mental proliferation. Because now you pause and relax and think. So when you pause, relax and think, your mind is not proliferating anymore. Your defilements are not arising anymore. And when you're able to do that, it actually reduces this emotional process called the chitta. And it reduces that, therefore it reduces the release of hormones. And when it reduces the release of hormones, it reduces tension in the body, it reduces this sensation in your body that disturbs your thinking mind, and therefore you can become more peaceful. Your body is more at peace. Your body is more in harmony and more unified with positive, rational thinking. Alright? So that is the very important tip that I'm offering you. Pay attention to your bodily conditions, and when you sense something wrong, pause, relax. How do you relax? Now, pause is easy. Don't react. Just stop. Don't react first. Don't say anything. Relax. How do you relax? Simple relaxation is take a deep breath. Slow, long, deep breath in and deep breath and long breath out. Even, long, 5 seconds each. Deep breath in for 5 seconds and then 5 seconds is done. Do this long breathing a couple of times and your whole body and mind will calm down. Okay? So that is how you can relax. When you do that, you can now think. And when you are thinking, now you are using the power of your rational thinking. It's your mano that is making decision for you. No longer your chitta. Your mano decides, your chetana is now, the volition is wholesome, and your action is skillful. So you begin to have wholesome intentions, wholesome chetana, and you begin to have skillful means, skillful karma. And what happens? Then you actually create positive and wholesome outcome. Your vipaka will become positive, and therefore it affects your life in a positive way. That is the consequence. So now I hope you have understood what I have explained from perception to consequence. If we don't do that, I'm going to remind you with this very ancient shloka. This Sanskrit shloka is used in ancient times, even before Gautama Buddha's time. It was used to teach children exactly what I have just explained a moment ago. It says, taking food, sleeping, avoiding dangers, and sexual activities, these are acts common between animals and humans. True or not? Animals and humans do these things, the same thing, right? The ability to think is what makes the difference between humans, right, and animals. Without thinking, humans are just like animals. In other words, learn to pause, relax, and think before you respond to the situation. Don't react emotionally. When you react emotionally, you are reacting like an animal. If you continue to react like an animal, you are creating animal karma. And when you die, there's a very high chance where you will be reborn. You know that. But I'm not going to predict it. Right? You can either go up, go down, or go straight. Right? The middle path is to go straight. So if you react like an animal, you love to be an animal, congratulations, your next life, you'll be one. Okay, so this freedom from tension by relaxing the body is consciously relaxing, so train your mind to do that. Because when you relax, your biochemical activities gradually subside, the tension in the body eases, and then the mind no longer disturbed by tension in the body, because a relaxed mind is a necessary condition for a calm mind. A relaxed body. A relaxed body is a necessary condition for a calm mind. So when you want to calm your mind, you turn your attention inwards and examine the processes going on. The simplest process your mind can examine is your breathing, your breath, right? That's why it's important to first learn and practice anapanasati, the mindfulness of breathing. Very important to learn that first. So the relaxed body suggests absence of threats, because your body is now relaxed. What does the amygdala do? The amygdala senses your body is relaxed. So the amygdala says, oh, no danger. So the amygdala is not aroused. No hormones come out. Then you put your conscious focus attention on wholesome intentions. What do you want to do that can help yourself enjoy your experience or do something more wholesome and positive? And then there is no mental proliferation, because mental proliferation is your defilements. Then you have no defilements. Your mind calms down, and no further arousal of your amygdala, so no further arousal of biochemical reactions. And therefore, the first part of relaxing your body is to break that chemical reaction, stop that chemical reaction. The second part is avoiding this mental proliferation. As I said, mental proliferation is your defilement. So avoid all these defilements, because the Buddha has taught us very wisely. Abandon your evil ways, right? Abandon these defilements. Let them go. Abandon them means let them go. Don't fight them. Let your defilements go by practicing calmness. And enter the good life. Do good things. Do good deeds. And maybe practice metta meditation. That can help. Enter the good life. And purify your mind through the practice of bhavana. Okay? Purify your mind. Cultivation. And this is the teaching of the Buddhas. And with that I conclude by pointing out, summarizing what we have covered, exploring the Buddha's teachings from a scientific perspective, how environmental activities stimulate our sense organs, giving rise to perceptions, and then the mind interprets these perceptions, leading to unconscious emotional arousal and reaction. And then there are consequences to our reactions, and therefore be mindful. Kayanupassana. Be mindful of your bodily conditions, and therefore learn how to pause and relax and think before you react. Relaxing is very simple. Just take deep breath. Long breath of 5 to 6 seconds each way. Breathing in for 5 to 6 seconds, gradually breathing out for 5 to 6 seconds. Do that 3 or 4 times and you will be amazed how relaxed you become physically and mentally. So in summary, the last slide, basically the Buddha has pointed out, when we are faced with changing vicissitudes of life, vicissitudes means various conditions and causes that are happening around us, continuously changing, anicca, continuously happening. When faced with these changing conditions of life, if the mind can be kept undisturbed, here, what the Buddha was pointing out is that the mind becomes undisturbed by emotions. Do not allow emotion to disturb the mind. That means free your mind from this emotional experience, emotional mental proliferation. Worry, lust and fear, this is the supreme bliss. It will lead to peaceful living. And this is from perception to consequence. Thank you very much. I hope you have any questions, please.